because of American pressure on Israel,
not Israel, while visiting Israel.
and unacceptable to Israel, to the land of Israel.
I'm Rabbi Pesach Woolicki, and you're watching Eyes on Israel. Over the past few months, the Biden administration has become more and more open about their desire to remove Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. In early March, the administration hosted Benny Gantz, Netanyahu's main rival, and they treated him like a head of state. He met with Kamala Harris, with senior State Department officials, and leaders in the Senate. Then, on March 14th, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer took to the floor of the Senate and blasted Israel. He called on Israel to go to new elections. That's right, he called for new elections in a different country. He sharply criticized Prime Minister Netanyahu and called him, quote, an obstacle to peace. Let's understand what's really happening here. Considering how inconceivable it is that Schumer would go off like this without the sign-off from the administration, Schumer's attacks on Israel should be taken as much more than a personal opinion. The speech was full of outdated foreign policy talking points and slanders against Israel worthy of an Ivy League Hamas rally. And it's worth listening to.
As a lifelong supporter of Israel, it has become clear to me the Netanyahu coalition no longer fits the needs of Israel after October 7th. The world has changed radically since then, and the Israeli people are being stifled right now by a governing vision that is stuck in the past. Nobody expects Prime Minister Netanyahu to do the things that must be done to break the cycle of violence, to preserve Israel's credibility on the world stage, and to work towards a two-state solution.
Listen up, Chuck. First of all, when it comes to the prosecution of the war on Hamas, Prime Minister Netanyahu is doing exactly what needs to be done to, quote, break the cycle of violence. You see, the cycle of violence you refer to actually goes like this. Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and everyday Arabs in Gaza, Judea, and Samaria, known as the West Bank, attack Israeli civilians. They fire rockets at our towns, they murder Israelis in their homes, they kidnap Israelis, and torture them. Israel then fights back, then there's a ceasefire, then it all begins again. That's the cycle of violence. And the only way to stop this cycle of violence is to destroy the capability of the terrorists. As for Israel's credibility on the world stage, Chuck, that's not why we're fighting this war. Yes, it's nice to have friends, but frankly, we prefer victory over an existential threat to credibility on the world stage. And you're right, Chuck. Prime Minister Netanyahu cannot be expected to work towards a two-state solution. You know why? Because nobody wants a two-state solution. Recent polling shows that 3 in 4 Israelis are opposed to the creation of a Palestinian state. And just last month, 99 of 120 members of the Knesset voted to reject recent U.S. calls for a Palestinian state. So you're right, Chuck. Nobody expects Netanyahu to do these things. They don't want him to. And as for being stuck in the past, as you say, this entire speech was one long restatement of failed 1990s Mideast policy built on the wishful thinking that led to October 7th in the first place. The fantasy that a moderate Palestinian leadership exists is the definition of being stuck in the past. Hey, Chuck, the Clinton administration called. They want their foreign policy back.
If he were to disavow Ministers Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and kick them out of his governing coalition, that would be a real meaningful step forward. But regrettably, there's no reason to believe Prime Minister Netanyahu would do that. He won't disavow Ministers Smotrich and Ben-Gvir in their calls for Israelis to drive Palestinians out of Gaza and the West Bank. He won't commit to a military operation in Rafah that prioritizes protecting civilian life. He won't engage responsibly in discussions about a day-after plan for Gaza and a longer-term pathway to peace. Hamas and the Palestinians who support and tolerate their evil ways, radical right-wing Israelis in government and society, President Abbas, Prime Minister Netanyahu. These are the 4 obstacles to peace. The Palestinian people must reject Hamas and the extremism in their midst. Quite frankly, I haven't heard enough Palestinian leaders express anguish about Hamas and other extreme elements of Palestinian society. I implore them to speak up now, even when it may be hardest, because that is the only true way to honor the lives of all those lost, by transcending the enmity and bloodshed and working together in good faith for a better future. Once Hamas is deprived of power, the Palestinians will be much freer to choose a government they want and deserve.
Ooh, boy. So, first, Chuck tells Prime Minister Netanyahu which members of his government he should fire. Then he calls Netanyahu an obstacle to peace. That's rich. You know what's an obstacle to peace, Chuck? A Palestinian leadership that teaches its children that murdering and raping Jews is a sacred act. And Chuck, the reason why you haven't heard enough Palestinian leaders express anguish about Hamas is that you haven't heard any Palestinian leaders denounce Hamas, and that includes the leaders of the Palestinian Authority, who you somehow think is suitable to lead a state that would be at peace with Israel. Why would they denounce Hamas? The Palestinian Authority is currently working to form a unity government together with Hamas. And polling shows overwhelming support for Hamas among Palestinians. Polling from late December, over 2 months into this war, shows that 72% of Palestinians were in favor of the acts committed by Hamas on October 7th. Yes, all those atrocities. Let's remember that Hamas was elected overwhelmingly to govern Gaza and would win an election in Judea and Samaria, known as the West Bank, if an election were held today. The reason Chuck hasn't heard any Palestinian leaders denounce Hamas is that they are Hamas. And that comment about a plan for Rafah that prioritizes civilian life, is Chuck Schumer now just parroting Hamas talking points about excessive civilian deaths? To quote John Spencer, chair of urban warfare studies at the Modern War Institute at West Point, who served for 25 years as an infantry soldier and 2 tours in Iraq, quote, Israel has taken more measures to avoid needless civilian harm than virtually any other nation that's fought an urban war.
Israel has the right to choose its own leaders, and we should let the chips fall where they may. But the important thing is that Israelis are given a choice. There needs to be a fresh debate about the future of Israel after October 7th. In my opinion, that is best accomplished by holding an election. Prime Minister Netanyahu's current coalition remains in power after the war begins to wind down and continues to pursue dangerous and inflammatory policies that test existing U.S. standards for assistance. Then the United States will have no choice but to play a more active role in shaping Israeli policy by using our leverage to change the present course.
Got that, everyone? So point 1, Israel is a democracy. Point 2, I, Chuck Schumer, am going to stand on the floor of the United States Senate and demand that Israelis in a different country hold new elections, even though the overwhelming majority of Israelis do not want new elections while the war is ongoing. As for confidence in the Israeli government, it's true that many Israelis are unhappy with Prime Minister Netanyahu for a whole host of reasons, but I assure you, Chuck, it's not because he rejects the diktats of the Biden administration to accept a push for a Palestinian state. And Chuck, I promise you that Israelis are most definitely deeply engaged in a fresh debate about the future of Israel after October 7th. Thank you for your comments. Because among the important lessons about Israel's future is the realization by a fast-growing number of Israelis that we cannot continue to be so reliant on the United States, that we must become a more self-sufficient country so that the U.S. doesn't have this kind of leverage in our national security decisions. More and more Israelis are realizing that U.S. policy interests, as they relate to Israel, have unfortunately more and more to do with preserving the U.S. relationship with Iran and Qatar that the Biden administration is so dead set on being friends with, and less to do with Israel's needs as a U.S. ally. And Chuck, you know what the fresh debate about Israel increasingly does not include? Any discussion of a two-state solution.
Now, I know that there are many on both sides who question how we can discuss peace at a moment like this. So many Gazans are displaced from their homes and struggling to meet their most basic needs. Many are still burying and mourning their dead. Entire families have been wiped out.
Really, Chuck? Is there evidence for this? The published numbers of civilian casualties provided by the laughable Gazan Health Ministry, run by Hamas, of course, even if we take those numbers at face value, they produce a non-combatant to combatant ratio of 1.4 to 1. A ratio so low is unprecedented in urban warfare, leading military experts like John Spencer, who we just quoted, to praise Israel's unprecedented ability to protect civilians. But I'd really like to know the details of these entire families that Chuck Schumer says have been wiped out. Throughout Jewish history, during the centuries of exile under hostile regimes, there were always Jews in the community known as court Jews. These Jews would get close to the authorities, they would be granted special privileges, they often became the tax collectors for the Jewish community, and in many cases would end up doing the dirty work of the anti-Jewish authorities, aiding and abetting their onerous anti-Jewish policies. In Nazi Germany, they were called the Judenrat. In the Soviet Union, they were called the useful Jews or the pocket Jews. And in the United States of 2024, we call them Chuck Schumer. We'll be right back with more Eyes on Israel in just a moment. Welcome back to Eyes on Israel. It's my honor to be joined in the Israel 365 studios by member of Knesset, Ohad Tal. Ohad, how are you today?
Thank you very much, Rav Pesach. Pleasure to be with you.
So just a couple days ago, we had the Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, coming out in a very aggressive way, criticizing the Israeli government, criticizing the Netanyahu government, calling on him to expel certain ministers from the government, including the head of the party that whose faction that you're a part of, also calling on Israelis to rethink their future and to take into account a Palestinian state. It was a very aggressive move. He was calling for new elections in Israel. How did that sit with you and other members of Knesset?
Well, I think I can only say in one word, it's a huge chutzpah. This is how we see it. I mean, the hypocrisy is unbelievable. I mean, we thought we are ally with America. We are, as far as I know, we are a very democratic, vibrant democracy. We have our own legal system of dealing with things, and interfering with our own internal issues while we are at war. And again, I want to remind everybody, we are now fighting a war for our own existence. That's the reality. And for somebody like him to interfere with what is happening here, call for elections, preaching about a two-state solution, which is basically, and people have to understand, it means the end of the Jewish state. This is what it means, not less than that. It's unbelievable.
You just said that a two-state solution would mean the end of the Jewish state. Now, most people hear two-state solution, it sounds like a good idea. It sounds like an end to the conflict. The Palestinians get a state, the Israelis get a state. What did you mean when you just said that it would be the end of the state of Israel?
You know, Israel, since the day it was established, pursuing peace, we were willing to make massive concessions in order to achieve peace. And I want to remind everybody, Israel is a country the size of New Jersey. And yet, many of our leaders in the past 30 years were willing to give parts of our lands to the Palestinians in the hope that will bring peace. We withdrew from the Gaza Strip in 2005, completely. Gave it all to the Palestinians. while billions of dollars were invested in Gaza in those past 20 years. Did we get peace out of it? No, we got the massacre of October 7th out of it. Instead of taking all these dollars and investing them in making Gaza the Singapore of the Middle East, they chose to take all this money, invest it in missiles and underground tunnels, and make it to the biggest terror nest of the world. So this is what happened only in Gaza. So basically, offering, again, the two-state solution means that we will do the same thing exactly at the heart of Israel, just a few kilometers from Jerusalem, from Tel Aviv, from Ben Gurion Airport. Does that make any sense to anybody? Even just talking about a two-state solution after October 7th will also send a message in the Middle East that if you want to achieve something, use terror, and you will get the support of the world for what you want to achieve. And one more thing. People have to understand, our soldiers coming back now from Gaza, every home they're meeting, they see huge picture of Al-Aqsa Mosque. They see maps of Israel with all the names of all the little cities and all the villages and the roads. Everything is in there. There's no green line. And instead of Israel, it says Palestine. The Palestinians, this is what we have to learn after October 7th. The Palestinians, they don't want a state to live side by side in peace and harmony with Israel. No, they want a state instead of Israel. According to a poll that was conducted by a Palestinian, Dr. Khalil Shkaki, only a couple of weeks ago, we learned that even today, 72% of the Palestinians justify the massacre of October 7th. 84% supporting Hamas today after what they did. So again, we have to realize that they want a state instead of Israel. They don't want a state next to Israel. And the second we will understand that and we will realize that, we will act in the right way to change this reality. We cannot take the risk of having another terror state at the heart of Israel, threatening our own existence.
Yeah, look, that number, that 72% of the Palestinians supported what Hamas did, and polling of Palestinians also shows that they don't want a two-state solution. Right. They want, as you just said, they want one state without any Jews. The Israeli public right now has no appetite for a two-state solution. So the arrogance of people like Chuck Schumer coming out and calling for a two-state solution at a time when no one in the conflict wants it is just absurd. So you sit on the Foreign Affairs Committee,
Security and Foreign Affairs.
Security and Foreign Affairs Committee in the Knesset, right. And right now Israel is nearing the total victory that we need to have in this war. Israel is talking about how we're going to be going into Rafah, we're going to be cleaning out the final brigades of Hamas and finally completing the mission that we started with. And a lot of people take a look at this situation and they say, look, you've already inflicted so much harm on Hamas. Even if you stop now, why do you keep calling it an existential threat? Why is it so critical to Israel's security to go into Rafah and to clean out the rest of Hamas?
Because we have to make sure that October 7th will not happen again. It's as simple as that. I've heard that President Biden said that we will not tolerate 30,000 more Palestinians dead. Which, first of all, these numbers are coming from the Palestinians themselves, which also was proven that they're lying a lot about the numbers. But even saying that these numbers are accurate, whose fault is it? Whose fault is it? Did we initiate anything on October 7th? No. On October 6th, there was a ceasefire. We didn't initiate anything. But they came. They butchered us. They slaughtered our families. They raped our women. They beheaded little babies. They kidnapped 240 people into Gaza, elderly, women, children, little babies. So we are now fighting Hamas in order to make sure that they will not be able to threaten our people again. If they will lay down their guns and will bring back the hostages, the war will end the second after. They're not doing that. They're not doing that. They're using their own people as human shields. They're shooting their own people. I mean, I don't have to remind you that when we started the war, we made millions of phone calls to people in Gaza. We've sent templates telling people, evacuate yourself to safe zones that we designated as safe zones for people to go to, with food, with water, with everything. Hamas people were shooting their own people, preventing them from going to these safe zones. Our soldiers were protecting civilians of Gaza going to these safe zones. So if there are 30,000 people dead in Gaza right now, the only people to blame for is Hamas. So we have to complete the job. We have to complete the job for our own sake and for the Palestinians' sake, who are suffering by the hands of Hamas. And we know that their headquarters now is in Rafah, so we'll have to go to Rafah. We don't have other choice but completing this mission, eradicating Hamas, because that's the only thing that will ensure that October 7th will not happen again, that will ensure that we will have another war with Gaza in a year or so. Because again, it's not good for them, it's not good for us, it's not good for anybody.
Yeah, that point you just made about how Hamas is responsible for all the civilian deaths, it sounds like a kind of like tit for tat, like he said, she said type of thing. But I think it's important for our viewers to know, it's important for everyone to understand that according to international law, Hamas is responsible for all those deaths, because according to the Geneva Conventions, if in a conflict, one of the parties in the conflict takes a civilian location and turns it into a military installation by using it as a launching pad for attacks, or using it as a munitions storehouse, that turns it into a military installation. And then when it is hit, if there are any civilian casualties, they are the responsibility of the party that turned the civilian location into a military installation.
And this is what we're seeing each and every day in schools, in mosques, in hospitals, everywhere, in houses. People we see under babies' beds, rockets ready to be launched towards Israel, under babies' beds in Gaza. So this is what Hamas did. They're using their own population in order to attack Israel and to threaten Israelis' lives every single day in the past 20 years. We cannot accept that anymore.
So, one last question. You, of all the members of Knesset, and our viewers who are not yet familiar with member of Knesset Tal, you are at the forefront of building a positive relationship with Christians around the world on behalf of the Israeli government, on behalf of the Knesset. And really, you recognize the importance of that relationship. And we know that there are millions and millions of Christians all across America who are strong supporters of Israel. And yet, when we look out in the streets, we see that it's Israel's enemies who are taking to the streets and making lots of noise on college campuses. What would you expect to see more out of our Christian population? We got 1 minute left.
I want to see them with us. I mean, I think we are in a moment in history which will determine the rest of where we're going to. And we need our friends in the world to stand with us on the right side of history, to stand with the good, not on the, I mean, it's very clear. Now the world is good, and this war is between good and bad, between good and evil. Stand with us, be with us on these moments, because that will determine where the history goes. And I hope we will see our friends. I mean, we're fighting for the same values. We're fighting for identity. We're fighting for ability of people to stand for their religious identity, for their family values, for their national values. This is what we're fighting for. And if, God forbid, we will not win this war, we will not be the only one to pay the price, because people in America and the free world will pay the price all over the world, because radical Islam will understand that the path of terror is the right path to go, and everybody will pay the price. So we want everybody to stand with us, our friends especially.
Member of Knesset, Ohad Tal, thank you so much for joining us here at the Israel 365 studios on Eyes on Israel. We're praying for your success, and we hope to have you back on the show many, many times. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back to Eyes on Israel, powered by Israel 365. Be sure to visit Israel365.com to check out all we have to offer there. Make Israel365news.com the place you go for accurate news and information about Israel from a biblical perspective. And be sure to follow me at Rabbi PW on Getter and X. And finally, as we build the Eyes on Israel community, be sure to spread the word about this show, and may God bless you for it. On November 26th of this past year, a demonstration was held in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets to show support for former President Jair Bolsonaro, a Christian identified with the political right, and to protest the current left-wing socialist Lula regime. Interestingly, there was a significant number of Israeli flags in the crowd. Now, why would pro-Bolsonaro, anti-socialist demonstrators in Brazil be waving Israeli flags? What does Israel and her current struggles have to do with opposition to socialism in Brazil? To fully appreciate the significance of this phenomenon, we should note that it's not limited to Brazilian Bolsonaro supporters. Consider the following quote from Geert Wilders, the leader of the right-wing nationalist PVV party in the Netherlands, who was recently elected to lead that nation's government. Quote, "The war against Israel is not a war against Israel. It is a war against the West. It is jihad. Israel is simply receiving the blows that are meant for all of us. If there would have been no Israel, Islamic imperialism would have found other venues to release its energy and its desire for conquest. The end of Israel would not mean the end of our problems with Islam, but only the beginning." Wilders and Bolsonaro are not outliers. Across the populist nationalist right throughout the world, support for Israel is the growing norm. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán and newly elected Argentinian President Javier Milei are two more examples of conservative nationalist leaders who are staunch supporters of Israel. Orbán has gone so far as to outlaw pro-Hamas demonstrations in Hungary. Hungary has also stood alone in vetoing multiple anti-Israel resolutions over the past month. First, Hungary was the sole European Union government to oppose a call by EU nations to prevent Israel from invading Rafah. And then, Hungary vetoed an attempt to pass sanctions by the EU against Israeli residents of Judea and Samaria. Throughout the world, populist nationalism is on the rise. While there are many issues that unite this movement across different continents and different nations, one issue stands above the rest. Supporters of Milei, Wilders, Orbán, and Bolsonaro, and others all understand that Western civilization is under attack and that the Israel-Hamas war is the front lines in that battle. From the pro-Hamas anti-Christmas demonstrations we saw in London, New York, and elsewhere, it's becoming clearer that this interpretation of the current moment is quite accurate. The seemingly laughable Queers for Palestine crowd actually makes a lot of sense. The very same cultural political camp that wants to tear down traditional Western values seeks the destruction of Israel. For Israelis, I think the time has come for some self-awareness. The entire Zionist project is the ultimate expression of Judeo-Christian nationalism, whether we admit it to ourselves or not. A successfully capitalist nation-state built on a religious ethnic identity with roots in the Bible checks all the boxes that the progressive globalist left despises. The left's abandonment of Israel was always inevitable. Is it true that right-wing nationalists have traditionally been infected with anti-Semitism in their camp? Certainly, but times are changing. On the left, anti-Semitism is growing and being normalized, while on the right, it's receding and being replaced by admiration for the state of Israel as the one country that is fighting back against jihadist Islam. And as Israelis, it's time that we understood the historical moment we are in and embrace this new reality and learn who our true friends really are. Joining me now is Brian Leib. He's an entrepreneur, a frequent contributor to various TV news programs, and a foreign policy expert. He's the CEO and founder of Henry Public Relations, a PR firm dedicated to elevating conservative voices, brands, and organizations in the national and international media. In addition, He's a senior fellow at the Center for Fundamental Rights in Budapest, Hungary. Brian, welcome to Eyes on Israel.
Rabbi, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here, and congratulations to you and everyone at Real America's Voice on this new program. So needed now more than ever before. Congratulations.
Thank you, Brian. So, Brian, not long ago, we had the Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, stand up in the Senate, criticize Israel, call for new elections there, and notably, and this is where it relates to my monologue teeing you up, he said that Israel cannot afford to be a pariah, basically warning Israel that we are on the verge of being isolated. Is Israel actually isolated in the world?
I think certainly there's a lot of rifts between the Biden administration and the Bibi administration right now. I think that's pretty clear for all of us to see. But where there is no rift when it comes to Israeli and American relations is people to people, and especially on the Republican side. Every single Republican in the House and in the Senate on a federal level stands with Israel. We've seen that in words and in actions, and you're going to continue to see that. Unfortunately, we've seen the Democratic Party really abandon, in a lot of ways, the support for Israel. The resolutions that we see on the House floor and Senate floors are overwhelmingly supported only by Democrats and not by Republicans. So, listen, I don't think Israel is isolated. I think certainly there is a rift between Biden and Bibi, but we also, I think, have to look bigger than this. And it speaks to your opening monologue in that, Israel has to look around the world for who their true friends are right now more than ever before. And you mentioned some of the countries and leaders that are standing tall with Israel. And I think Israelis really need to understand that. And there's more countries too. I mean, you have Italy's Meloni, who is also standing tall. I mean, there's a lot of other countries that really are standing with Israel. And they're standing with Israel, by the way, for my opinion, because they have a strong belief in understanding in Judeo-Christian values. That's the bedrock of a lot of these societies, from Hungary to Poland to Italy to the Netherlands. It's a base knowledge and understanding of Judeo-Christian values, something that I think in America we maybe have lost touch with a little bit, unfortunately.
Yeah, Brian, so you've been very involved with Hungary. I mentioned your work there in introducing you. And Hungary, really standing alone, has really stood out. In the current geopolitical makeup, where you have the China, Russia, Iran axis, which is overtly anti-Israel, and then you have the kind of EU, globalist, Biden administration gang who've been breathing down Israel's neck, trying to pressure Israel to do things that are against our own self-interests. And standing alone, seemingly isolating themselves on Israel's behalf, is Hungary. Can you speak specifically to Hungary's affinity for Israel? Where does that come from, and how should we understand it?
Well, let me first start by telling a very, very brief story. I promise it won't be a long story. I was in Budapest 2 days after October 7th. In fact, when my plane was landing to speak at a pro-Israel summit that was organized by the Center for Fundamental Rights, I was starting to get all the videos and images in of the horrific attacks that were happening in Israel. And the Center for Fundamental Rights made a decision to move forward with the summit, but they turned it into a solidarity summit. And it was at that summit that I met with every single leader you can possibly think of within Hungary. But there was one conversation in particular that really stood out to me, and that was with Hungary's defense minister. And I went over to him after his speech, which was just a truly amazing speech, and I put my hand on his shoulder. I said, "It's an honor to meet you, and thank you so much for committing to stand with Israel." And he looked at me, he leaned in, he got a little close, and he put his hand back on my shoulder. So hands on each shoulder right now. And he says to me, "Brian, when the world turns on Israel, and we all know they will, Hungary is going to continue to stand tall with Israel." So it's a nice story, I think, for the Israeli people to hear and know. And I think, listen, when it comes to Hungary, it has one of the largest Jewish communities in all of Europe, a very thriving community, continuing to grow. But Hungary, like a lot of these other European countries, they believe in Judeo-Christian values, and they believe in supporting the Jewish community inside of their own country in Hungary, and also on the world stage in Israel. And in fact, Hungary was one of the first countries to send C-130 or whatever their version of a cargo plane is into Israel, and sending in supplies. And we've seen Hungary standing with Israel on the world stage at the EU. Hungary's foreign minister visited Israel just recently, gave a brilliant interview to the Jerusalem Post where he unequivocally said that Israel has to finish the job with Hamas. No ifs, ands, or buts. It is an existential threat for Israel, but also, for the world. So, I think back to your question, why is Hungary standing with Israel? I think it's the Judeo-Christian values for sure that they believe in, but I also think it's just common sense. I mean, Hungary is a country of common sense that, has really just stood firm and stood tall. And you mentioned how, pro-Hamas protesters have been banned. I mean, here's another little piece of information for your audience. Holocaust denial in Hungary is illegal. If you say anything publicly, from a bullhorn in a public square to sitting in a restaurant privately, if it's publicly said or you're doing anything to deny the Holocaust existed, you can be arrested and charged and put in jail for up to 3 years. So it's just, this is common sense things and zero tolerance policies that I think Hungary is leading on the world stage when it comes to these things.
Brian Leib, thank you so much for joining us on Eyes on Israel. We hope to have you back many, many times. We'll be right back with more Eyes on Israel right after this. Welcome back to Eyes on Israel. If you're watching this show on the day that it is airing on Real America's Voice, then today is the festival of Purim. So happy Purim. This is a Jewish holiday, a festival that has its source at the end of the book of Esther. As the book of Esther itself states, towards the end of the book, in commemoration of the great victory and the celebration that occurred after that victory, at the end of the book of Esther, the Jewish people were victorious over their genocidal enemies who were attempting to wipe them out in Persia. And in commemoration of this great victory, we have a new festival called Purim. And the practices of the day include the reading of the book of Esther in its entirety in the synagogue twice, once in the evening at the beginning of the festival, that would have been last night, and once in the morning. In addition to that, as the book of Esther mandates, gifts are given to the poor, so everyone in the community gathers together money in advance of Purim and on Purim itself to give it out, large quantities of money given out to poor people that day, as well as giving gifts of food items to each other. It's a day of a lot of joy, a lot of celebration. The strangest thing about the book of Esther, and this is what I'd like to explore right now, is the fact that the book of Esther, although it is a book in the Bible, does not mention God even once. Not once. Read through the whole book. It doesn't even refer to God obliquely in some way. It doesn't even really hint at God. There's no mention of God in the book of Esther. And this, in fact, led some in the Christian tradition to not want to include the book of Esther in the Bible. And in fact, there are traditions within Christianity that don't include it. Even within the Jewish tradition, at the time of the canonization, at the choice of which books were going to be included in the Bible, the Talmud tells us that there was a debate about whether or not to include the book of Esther. So why would there be a book in the Bible that does not even mention God once? To answer that question, I'd like to ask another question. At the end of the book of Esther, in that section where it tells us that there is going to be established a new festival to commemorate this great victory, we read as follows, and I'm picking this up in Esther chapter 9, verse 20. Mordechai recorded these events, and he sent dispatches to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Ahasuerus, near and far, charging them to observe the 14th and 15th days of Adar every year, the same days on which the Jews enjoyed relief from their enemies, and the same month which had been transformed for them from one of grief and mourning to one of festive joy. They were to observe them as days of feasting and merrymaking, and as an occasion for sending gifts to one another and presents to the poor. The Jews accordingly assumed as an obligation that which they had begun to practice and which Mordechai prescribed for them. For Haman, the son of Hamdata, the Agagite, the foe of all Jews, had plotted to destroy the Jews and had cast a pur, that is, a lot, with intent to crush and exterminate them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded, with the promulgation of his decree, let the evil plot which he devised against the Jews recoil on his own head. So Haman and his sons were hung on the tree, meaning they were hung. For that reason, these days were named Purim, after the poor. Now let me explain what we just read. This tells the story about how there was this plot against the Jews, led by Haman, this chief advisor to the king Ahasuerus, who wanted to wipe out all the Jews. The plot was foiled, and the Jews won. Haman and his sons, who were his advisors, his party, as it were done away with. And then the text tells us that these days, these festive days for eternity, are to be called Purim, the plural of the word pur, this word that appears in the book of Esther, which is a lot, the casting of a lot. This is very strange. Of all of the plot points in the book of Esther, why do we care about the casting of a lot? Let's first recount the plot. Towards the beginning of the book of Esther, Haman, who hates the Jews, gets elevated to be a senior advisor to King Ahasuerus. He decides that he wants to commit genocide against the Jews. So the first thing he does is he chooses a day for this genocide. And we read in chapter 3, in the first month, that is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus' reign, a pur, which means a lot, was cast before Haman concerning every day and every month until it fell upon the 12th month, that is the month of Adar. In other words, Haman chose the date for the genocide by casting lots, kind of a little raffle. And now at the end of the book, after the victory, we're told that the name of the holiday commemorating the victory is going to be Purim, to remind us of the fact that Haman chose the date by casting lots. Now, this is very strange. Think about it for a moment. Who really cares how Haman chose the date for Purim? Let's say he had chosen the date of, I don't know, his anniversary or his wife's birthday or his own birthday or the king's birthday. What difference does it make that the way that Haman chose the date to wipe out all the Jews was by casting lots? Why was that significant enough that after the victory, Mordechai and Esther, the leaders of the Jewish people at the time, decided that this new festival, this new annual day to commemorate the victory, would be named after the lots? But folks, this is exactly the point of the whole festival. You see, Haman believed in chance. Lots, lotteries, raffles, seem to be complete chance. Haman was an Agagite, as we spoke about last week, a descendant of Amalek. He doesn't believe that God really runs the world or that there's any special providential relationship between the Jewish people and the God of Israel. So Haman worshiped chance. He believed that everything in life is random. There is no real plan. There's certainly no God who's in charge. So he casted lots because to him, chance is all there is. And then what happened in this story? Although God is not mentioned in the book of Esther, the story progresses through a series of what looks like coincidences. Esther appointed queen after a strange turn of events, before Haman was even elevated to be the second in command to the king. For some reason that is not explained at all in the book, she concealed her Jewish identity. On the very day that Haman went to King Ahasuerus to ask him to hang Mordechai, that was the day, at that very moment, the king was reading in a book about favors that Mordechai had done for him. At that very moment, favors that had been done many years earlier. And on it goes. The book of Esther is filled with what appears to be coincidences. Coincidences that all just happen to work out, so much so that the original plot of genocide against the Jews gets completely turned on its head, and the Jews instead are victorious over their enemies. And that is the entire point of the festival of Purim. Mordechai and Esther, the leaders of the Jewish people at the time, named the festival Purim to poke fun at people like Haman, to ridicule them. They called the festival lots, chance, because we, people of faith, know that there's no such thing as chance. What looks like chance and what looks like coincidence is really God in control. But here's the thing. It's not like the splitting of the Red Sea or 10 plagues on the Egyptians, miracles that are overt for all to see. When God acts behind the scenes, it looks like just fortunate coincidences, good fortune, chance working in our favor. The festival of Purim was so named to highlight the fact that God's redemption of his people doesn't always include overt miracles. It often includes, and I would say more often includes, God acting behind the scenes in a way that we don't necessarily see him. His name is not in the book, but it's all God anyway. And that's why the festival is called Purim, to remind us that there are those who believe in chance and there are those who know that God is really in charge. And that's why the name of God does not appear in the book of Esther. The name of God doesn't appear because that's the whole lesson of Esther. We live in a time today where we don't have miracles like the splitting of the sea or the 10 plagues or other kind of overt miracles that we see in the Bible. And that leads a lot of people to think that God is not really with us, that maybe we're just fallen into the hands of nature. But the book of Esther and the festival of Purim are here to remind us that at those times in history, where all you have is the coincidences, as it were, the events that take place in the headlines that might seem to a casual observer to be unrelated or just coincidental, that's really God working behind the scenes. So enjoy your Purim, remember to celebrate, and remember that no matter what things look like on the outside, God is always in charge. For more inspirational teachings, biblical teachings, if you enjoyed this, make sure to check out my book, Verses for Zion. This is my most recent book of biblical teachings. I'm sure you'll enjoy it, and you can get a copy of it at www.getvfz.com. You can't find it on Amazon. It's a great way to support the show, and you'll find inspirational teachings there for every day of the year, all about the God of Israel, the people of Israel, and the land of Israel. Thank you so much for watching Eyes on Israel. Please tell everyone about it, and please make sure to follow us on social media. And you can catch us here every week on Real America's Voice.